Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the big stories in the region. On Sunday, October 29th, Turkey will be celebrating its 100th anniversary as a republic. Today I'll be discussing the legacy of Kemal Ataturk, the iconic founder of modern Turkey. His determined drive to steer Turkey towards the West continues to divide the country between those who support his secularist ideals and the rest who believe that his efforts to stamp out religiosity from public life were an aberration. For the past 20 years, Turkey has been led by an overt Islamist, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Critics accuse the president of seeking to reverse Turkey's secular course. So how much has Turkey really changed in these 100 years? With us here today to discuss these complex issues is Selim Koru, a Turkish scholar and the editor of Kültürkampf, a blog that delves into popular culture and politics in contemporary Turkey. Selim is among my favorite Turkey analysts. Welcome to our program, Selim. It's a delight to have you with us here today.
Thank you. It's delighted to be here.
So we're going to be talking about Turkey's 100th birthday as a republic, which will be celebrated across the country on October 29th. So in the run-up to this anniversary, of course, there's a lot of, well, not a lot, but quite a bit of punditry. I guess everybody's much more focused on the Middle East, on Gaza right now, but still, it is a significant date and a time to sort of take stock of what's happened in this past century. So to play the devil's advocate here, perhaps, I mean, isn't Turkey looking a little more like it did in 1923, that in fact what ails Turkey perhaps is the fact that how little it's changed on key issues like, you know, the Kurds, on corruption, on cult leadership, you know, the leadership cult, the instinct for that, militarism. The military, yes, maybe not as strong a political force as it was, but it's become a very, very critical tool of this regime, militarism, you know, with its forays into Syria, Libya, Armenia, etc. So, you know, I would argue that in some ways Turkey, in fact, hasn't changed, and that's the real problem here.
Structurally, I think you're right in the sense that, yes, at the beginning, so 1923, you have a one-man regime, as it's often said. And, you know, until Ataturk dies, that doesn't change, that sort of structure, right? And now we have a one-man regime, certainly. And Erdogan is, without any doubt, the most powerful and the most successful Turkish leader since Ataturk, right? Now, that being the case, the sort of charge or the polarity of Turkey as a country and as a state has changed significantly, I'd say. I mean, Ataturk's project was about sort of encasing the sort of current borders of the republic, making that stick as much as possible, right? Because this generation had lived through a lot of trauma. They'd seen their country shrink more and more, right? So his project was about sort of maintaining that territorial structure and then transforming the country into sort of a European modern nation state, right? With Erdogan, the charge of the project has changed, right? So he's also interested in modernization. He's also interested in sort of the national project as well, in sort of unification and all that stuff. But he doesn't have the same Republican model in mind, right? Because his sort of ideological descendants are actually, they trace themselves back to the monarchists of the late Ottoman period and early Republican period. because the Kemalist project was from its beginning severely criticized by a group of Islamists and modern and monarchists, right? And Erdogan is part of that tradition. So his point is the caliphate, for example, that was abolished in favor of a republic, was an immense source of power for Turkey, right? And it was an immense source of power because of its sort of expansionist potential, because Turkey was more than just simply a country. It was an imperial project, right? So part of what we're seeing is a return to that imperial project of Turkey's borders are now more wishy-washy, right? It's not very clear where the country starts and where it ends anymore, right? And that's by design. That is a consequence of this political project. Its military deployments, right, are much more aspirational, I would say. Um, it's culture as well. I think, empires behave in different, like the United States, for example, is a much more sort of, if you just look at everyday culture in the United States, it's much more militaristic. It's much more sort of much more today they call it tactical or tactical or whatever. People own guns in their homes. It's much more about soldiering and that sort of thing. Whereas in Europe, you have a strategic culture that's very comfortable, right, with American hegemony, and that's it doesn't feel an urgency to engage in sort of preparation and defense and all that stuff, right? Whereas Turkey is much more like the United States today. It's much more ready, if you will.
Well, I would push back a little against what you're saying, Selim, because I think it's always been pretty paranoid, Turkey, and always fearful of all these enemies and, malign agendas, all a hangover, obviously, from the days when the empire was crumbling and the victors of the war were trying to partition Turkey, the Kurdish state, the Armenian state, etc. So when you talk about the blurry borders and Turkish militarism, I would like to refer us back to, the Kurdish issue, which in my mind seems, an abiding problem in Turkey, and one that is very much the root of quite a bit of the insecurity that Turkey has, which predates this regime. And so where this one, uses different means to address it militarily, because the conflict has shifted beyond its borders, I guess you could say, quote unquote, it's been successful in that sense in moving it outside Turkey. And it's now a conflict where obviously you don't have guerrilla warfare that resulted in huge casualties for the Turkish military at times anyway. So, I mean, again, I would argue that it's precisely these huge problems that remain unaddressed by Turkey that make its future, this country that has so much potential, such a great entrepreneurial spirit, that creative people, such a young population still, even though that's changing. That's what's kind of holding it back, and the fact that it's failed to solve these problems allows these authoritarian leaders to retain power, whether they're Erdogan with his big following or whether it's military-backed, civilian governments that we saw for successive decades.
Not sure. I mean, obviously the Kurdish question is very important, and it was certainly 2015 was a turning point in terms of strategic culture for Turkey, because it's when the Kurdish peace process broke down and the Erdogan government sort of turned the corner and became much more convinced that it could find military solutions to these problems. Whereas before, it was very critical of the military establishment, the Kemalist establishment, and thought that it could sort of transcend the Kurdish issue much more. And yeah, I mean, they reverted to some of the sort of pre-existing attitudes towards the Kurdish issue. But at the same time, I mean, Erdogan is I mean, Turkey and the sort of new Turkey phenomenon, most recent new Turkey phenomenon, is just one of many others, right? A similar dynamic is happening in India. It's, it's happening in Hungary. It's happening in Russia, right? There's some fail starts like Brazil, the United States. So there seems to be something in the world today that invites this sort of neo-nationalism, right? Or it's been called many different things, right? But or revisionism, shall we say, right? There seems to be something about, especially the liberal, perhaps hegemonic moment of the United States that invites this, that makes people think in this way, and that makes people sort of yearn back and try to radically revise what they see as sort of the order of the world they've been given. And the Kurdish issue, I think, is one of the things that prevented Turkey from being more democratic. But I'm not convinced that it. I mean, we obviously can't ever know for sure, but I'm not convinced that it was this sort of the original sin even of the country that prevented it from moving forward.
Oh, I wouldn't call it the original sin. I think, if you need a sort of a baseline, perhaps the original sin was not coming to, grips with what happened in 1915 with the Armenian genocide. If this new republic could have sort of cleaned the slate and perhaps faced up to it. But of course, it was a different time. It was a time when, National Socialism was rising in Germany. You had, Mussolini in Italy. So to expect Swedish behavior, quote unquote, from Ataturk in those circumstances is probably fanciful. But I would still insist it's this failure to, own up to its original sins and, to sort of engage in meaningful self-critique that has held Turkey back in many ways and just deepened the divides. But turning to religion, because of course the biggest critique of Ataturk was, as we said, the fact that him and his followers were accused of trying to strip society of Islam in such a way that it was like hugely traumatic. And that this current government is all about trying to, reverse that imbalance. Would you say that Erdogan has succeeded? Because I'm reading all kinds of surveys about how younger people are not as pious as they used to be, of Islam, a new generation of Islamist feminists who find the figure of Ataturk interesting, if not appealing. And I mean, writ large, that there is sort of a bit of pushback now against this heavy injection coming from above of, pious thinking culture.
Yeah. I mean, I have conflicting ways of thinking about this. In a way, if we take religion seriously, then we'd have to say that, Erdogan and people like Erdogan aren't succeeding. But if we don't, then if we take it as a sort of political phenomenon, then we might be inclined to say that they are. So specifically, what I'm thinking about is, if religion is sort of a way of moving past this life and really being in touch with the transcendent, then it's failing because it's much more worldly than it ever used to be. Right? All these religious people, all these religious orders in Turkey, for example, much more powerful, and they strive for power, right? There is this very, very overt attempt to be much more powerful in this world, right? And you know, theologians might discuss this as well. Like, is Islam supposed to be powerful in this world? Is it supposed to aspire to that much power and stuff? But of course, sort of striving for power makes you do things that aren't really religiously permissible, right? It makes you build yourself into something that commits lots of sins, I would argue, right? And if you look at society today, Turkish society today, even the Islamists are much less Islam sort of religious than they used to be. And when they sort of there are all these studies about how people justify religious behavior. You know, do you pray 5 times a day because you're supposed to, or do you feel the need to justify that by saying, oh, it's actually healthy for you to sort of get up? It's like Islamic yoga or something like that.
Islamic
Like,
yoga.
you know, fasting is supposed to be healthy for you, right? And they you know, all these people feel the need to revert to all these justifications to get people into that. And even if they don't, like, if you're working in some office and you know the boss is going to Friday prayer every Friday, um, you are going to have this sort of incentive to go along, right? To
Sure.
be with the powerful people when they're being religiously observant, right? Um, it's like people smoking because stuff gets done on the smoking break kind of thing. Uh, you know, so in that sense, we might look at a country like Turkey and say, well, it's less religious. But in another sense, you do see religion becoming much more prominent and sort of a powerful symbol in the country, right? So it is so Islam, I would say, is thinner in Turkey than it used to be, but it's more prevalent.
So you would say spiritually thinner, but I guess in terms of how it's leveraged politically, more prevalent.
Yeah, it's ubiquitous, yeah.
So is that a good thing? I mean, Ataturk wouldn't have liked that. We know that.
He wouldn't have. No, they that group, especially in the military, the late Ottomans were sort of many of them subscribed to a sort of European fad of it's been called vulgar materialismus, like a vulgar materialism. It's got German origins of sort of is this very base sort of atheism and scientism, and he was sort of into that a little bit, and he certainly had radical sort of secularist ideas for the time. He certainly would have liked it. I would argue that many of the people who sort of are very overtly religious aren't really religious in any meaningful sense, right? That there's all this talk of heaven and hell, which is very much alive in Turkey, and all this talk of, you know, what's permissible and what's not, especially among the elite, is sort of for show, that people don't actually believe in these things.
I mean, that's one thing, but then when it's written into law, it's another. And women, particularly, are feeling more vulnerable today than they did, say, when Erdogan first came to power, and was, in fact, pushing reforms that were hugely to their advantage. Remember when they revised the civil code, where men are no longer the head of the family, for example, when intramarital rape became a criminal offense in Turkey. These were huge things, and now all being reversed with Turkey pulling out of the Istanbul Convention, and you know, a lot of talk about, again, revising laws in ways that favor men. Those have real consequences, especially, you know, and being done in the name of Islam, of religion, of piety. So, you know, it's real.
Yeah, I think those kinds of things are on track to continue, certainly. And I would say again, that is part of a global trend. You know, if you look at other big conservative leaders in places like India and Russia and elsewhere, similar things are happening, but they're sort of dressing it up in their own
Sure,
local
sure. I
culture.
mean, the context is very important, but if I'm a Turkish woman, um, who believes that I should have, equal rights as men, equal opportunity, freedom to, worship, dress as I choose. I don't care if it's also happening in India. I want to know what I can do to stop it in my own country where I live. And another of the great tragedies of Turkey today is the fact that there is no real credible opposition. And I think what we just had in May with the total collapse and, they were disgraced. The opposition was disgraced. What can Turks who disagree with this trajectory do to reverse it? Because a lot of them are voting with their feet. They're leaving the country. Bright people like you are leaving the country in droves.
I don't know. I think it's very difficult. I think, especially in a country like, especially in Turkey, where I think the regime is very skilled, right? They're very good at keeping themselves above water and making sure that the opposition doesn't reform and regroup, right? But very good at playing that game. They've proven that to everybody, I think. Even when people were sort of betting against them in this last election, they were good at keeping that up. I don't know where we can look for hope. It is hopeful that some of the sort of the status quo power, shall we say, in the United States, for example, you've got a president who um, claims to be the most pro-labor or pro-labor union president in recent memory, for example, or engaging in industrial policy and all that stuff. Maybe that's a hopeful start to a new sort of pattern that could emerge, right?
But
I
I mean,
don't know.
in our lifetimes, in mine anyway, Joe Biden being pro-labor doesn't matter at all to my future in Turkey.
No, in Turkey, I don't think in Turkey we're going to see sort of anything good happening for the non-Erdogan voting half of the country anytime soon, I think. I think what's likely to happen in Turkey is that um, the system becomes more entrenched because Erdogan has currency now, not just among his sort of half of voters, but among the opposition as well. I think they've destroyed the opposition so thoroughly and undermined them and routed them in successive elections so thoroughly that um, people are sort of depoliticized and they're willing to sort of accept the Erdogan order, accept the Erdogan victory, and then defer whatever political opinions they have to the future. I think that's what's going on.
So this one-man regime is well entrenched. There's no credible threat to it. Yet, of course, it's one man, and he, like with the rest of us, is immortal. So I guess from the regime's perspective, the biggest uncertainty with regard to its, its ability to sustain itself is succession. So that's one thing I'd like to talk to you about. If and when, well, not if, when Erdogan passes away, what happens?
Yeah, that is, I think that's the big question hanging over them now. That is the big problem they'll have. I don't think there's any obvious successor. And every once in a while he tries with his sons-in-law. Well, with the one son-in-law, anyways.
Well, that didn't turn out too well, did it? He kind of
Yeah,
got the
yeah.
economy and then went into hiding. Now they are sort of, I guess, grooming the Mr. Drone,
I'm
the
not sure
younger
they are.
daughter's husband, who.
I think he wants to. He wants to get into politics. He
You think
wants to.
he does, but you're not certain that the father-in-law is totally on board with it?
No, I'm not. Yeah.
Really,
I don't
even though
think, I
Sumaya
don't
is
think
his
it would be.
favorite and that she's smart as a whip. I mean, I've
Yeah,
spent some,
sure.
I mean, enough time with her to realize that she's pretty intelligent, charismatic. I mean, I don't share her worldview, obviously, but she's an impressive young woman.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, listen, intelligent people are a dime a dozen. There's intelligent people everywhere. It's just, I obviously she's well placed, but negotiating power and managing power, managing people at that level, um, that's just something else. And I don't think the Bayraktar brothers really have that.
Sounds
They're good
like a rock
business
band,
people.
the Bayraktar brothers.
Yeah, I mean, they're a good team. They're good at business. Um, Obviously good at the engineering and the science, right? And picking good people and producing good products and things. But politics is a politics at that level, at that high level, is a whole different game.
So who do
And
you think is well positioned then? Because of course the other figure that everyone points to is the foreign minister, um,
yeah,
Hakan Fidan. And I mean, all the social media around him, he's clearly, there are people out there who are trying to sort of push him. I mean, when you look at his social media compared to Çavuşoğlu, oh my God, it's night and day, right? Very glossy, just, yeah.
I think the Fidan option is even less likely
Oh,
than
tell me why. This is fascinating.
like
Why?
he's just not, he doesn't even look like a politician. He doesn't even have that sort of energy around him. When he
Are we
meets
sure of that?
people,
Maybe not quite yet, but just his body language, the way he carries himself, the way he sits, projecting so much confidence, machismo. I mean, it's like he's straight out of Valley of the Wolves, kind of, and sort of
Hakan Fidan,
intelligence background, sort of in the eyes of the man on the street. He's, I've used this word before about him, makes him kind of sexy, right? Appealing, attractive, projecting strength, and all of that. And I
I don't,
mean, what's really amazing is that there are a lot of Kurdish people who feel that way about him, imagining that and just clinging to the belief that somehow he was really in favor of those peace talks, when in fact he was just an instrument, in my view. But anyway, I'll let you carry on.
job. I don't see that about him. And I don't see, okay, what makes Erdogan special is that he's able to, he's never backed down. He's got that willpower, that impenetrable, unstoppable willpower. That's the sine qua non of any great leader, right? And he's able to manage people in a very sort of visceral way. He makes them compete against each other, right? And through that competition, he's able to manage them. It's really fascinating. And I think that developed through many years of sort of grassroots politics. Right? He's honed that, and his mind is very much the mind of I won't say a poet, but that like poetry recitals were, I think, his formative intellectual training. Right? He recited lots of poetry, and he read, religious texts
Well,
religiously.
just being able to memorize all of that requires a pretty big brain, doesn't it?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so Erdogan had that, and he's always had that sort of exceptionalism, right? Um, Now I understand that the next person, we can't just look for another Erdogan, right? That never works. History doesn't work that way. The next person's always different, especially the next person after somebody like this who builds a regime. right? That's not a good way of looking for somebody, but they still have to have a similar, at least, skill set. They'd still have to, because this is an incredibly centralized
But
regime, right?
is he the one thinking about all of that, or is it the people around him? Do you think that he is, you know, very concerned about succession? Because somebody like that, in my mind, sees themselves as sort of immortal and
I think
unbeatable.
he probably is concerned about succession. Yeah,
Mm.
he does care about that. He Because that's how you beat the Ataturks of the world, right? That's how you, well, the Ataturk. That's how you endure. Your thing should endure longer than his.
Well, I mean, Hugh Pope, the British journalist who used to, you know, be based in Turkey and wrote that great book with his former partner, Turkey Unveiled, Nicole Pope. He said that Erdogan is jealous of Ataturk because he hasn't managed to surpass him. Would you agree with that assessment as we
Well, I
approach this
think
big anniversary, which the government clearly isn't so keen on celebrating, ultimately? At least that's what the secularists say. And that they're almost, you know, relieved that this Gaza thing happened because it allows them to, you know, have a more or less sort of festive anniversary. They have an excuse at least.
I think Erdogan, maybe a decade ago, um, the comparison to Ataturk might have elicited jealousy or resentment, but now it's a much more realistic prospect, I think.
But
And
his legacy will be the defining legacy of modern Turkey until someone like him and of greater consequence comes along. Is that what you're saying?
So in the Islamist thinking, the Kemalist reforms and the Kemalist Republic was a sort of deviation of the natural path of history and
The
sort of and
parentheses, the 70-year parentheses.
yeah, exactly. It was a deviation of the civilizational core of the Turkish people, right? Never mind that the Turkish people as a nation, that's a modern concept. Um, so So I do think his thinking is that he is closing the parentheses, right? And if you actually go on the Centennial's website, there's a website with
Yeah, I've been
because they've
on.
been planning it since 2020. Um, if you go on the website, there's a very clear comparison between Ataturk and Erdogan. Right, it's like half the website is devoted to Ataturk, half the website is devoted to Erdogan, and then it's just all Erdogan. Right. There's a timeline where the timeline of the last 100 years. It's like the first 10, 15 years are very busy. And then in between, nothing happens pretty much. Very few things. And then it's Erdogan, a lot of activity once again, right? So two great men at sort of opposing ends of a century. And one of Erdogan's slogans recently has been, We've done 100 years work in 20 years.
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly? Like what happened in the other 80 years? Well, that's the parenthesis. That's what you have to undo, but you have to do so gradually, very, very deliberately, right?
But that's
Which
what
which
they've
makes
been
him,
doing. And they've
yeah,
been very successful, some would say, but others would counter, well, half of the population, as you pointed out, is opposed to this regime and to its ideology. So I guess my final question to you, Selim, though I could talk to you for hours, is are people, let's say, of your parents' generation who were firmly, I'm not saying your father or your parents were, but in general, the sort of secular people in Turkey, are they sort of on the brink of extinction? and are people of my generation who hoped there could be a meeting somewhere, a common ground that could be forged between people who think like us, let's say liberal, urban, secular, but open-minded and want to fix all these big problems in Turkey. That people like us too, there's just no room left for us. I mean, many of us, of course, can't even go back to Turkey. So is that all, are we all being squeezed out? And is there a new generation of Turks who are very different to your parents' generation, my generation, who are now prevailing? And that really is a new Turkey, that the Turkey as we knew it is dead or dying.
Well, it certainly seems to be the intent to squeeze out people who don't like this regime, right? And the people who can get squeezed out are the people with the most means to it, right? As you pointed out, if you have the money and the skills and the diplomas, you can move to Europe or the United States or wherever you want to go. Nobody really moves to non-Western countries, or very few people do. But I'm not sure if this is the end, really. If this great revisionist project has actually succeeded and that there is no turning back.
Or turning in a different direction. Back is probably not what we want, right?
Yeah. I think the hope of many liberals and leftists was to build on the Republic, right? To recognize its serious flaws and mistakes. But then with every generation to reinterpret and refine it, right? To make it better as you go along. I think, pardon me, the optimistic take is that maybe sometimes countries need to go through phases like this, where, it is very destructive, but I could also see 10 years, 15, 20 years down the line that, this could be seen as a time when we as a country very clearly were able to see that Islamism didn't really work, that it might lead us to get a bit disenchanted with nationalism, right? The way that the Europeans, for example, to some extent have been able to do, right? So that might very well happen.
But I mean, doesn't something really, really bad need to happen for people to get there? I mean, I'm guessing that somewhere down the road after what's happened in Israel, thinking people will question. They already are, to what extent their own failures and policies led to this. So that's the success of this regime. As you said, everything is done very gradually, very systematically. The big conflicts have been moved beyond Turkey's borders, like with the Kurds, for instance. So where does that pressure come from? Of course, the economic collapse that people were praying for. Anyway, people who want this regime to go, they'd never admit that, but obviously they saw that as the last chance for this regime to go. That's not happening either. So, and I hope it doesn't, for the sake of all the people back home. But I'm just trying to.
Yeah,
I guess it's stuff that happens outside Turkey's borders too, that Turkey has no control over ultimately, perhaps, that can shift things as well. We just don't know.
Yeah, things seem to be becoming riskier and riskier.
Oh yeah.
Organized violence on a larger and larger scale. More wars around Turkey. Turkey's participating in more wars as well. Also internally in Turkey, right? There's migrant populations moving in. into different parts from
Yeah.
different parts of the
So
world.
I did say that was my final question. We've run way over time, but that's fine. And I apologize to the audience for my dogs panting. The Syrians, I mean, Turkey is in for a huge, a significant demographic shift, isn't it? Where, you know, you're going to have a significant Arab population, right? And
Yeah.
one that you can't really assimilate, and, you know, you can't call them desert Turks or whatever. They're going to keep speaking Arabic and, you know, living their culture the way they lived it back home. I mean, how does Turkey deal with that? That's one of the big challenges that I see further down the line, and which is why I also think politicians like the guy Ümit Özdağ do have a future of sorts.
Yeah. It seems that that's where things are headed, where well, domestically, I think that the big dividing line, especially in this election, was, well, there were two things. There was the economy and there was migration, right? Those were the two themes for the opposition. And I think we'll keep seeing those two themes, with migration sort of increasing in importance, because a lot of people who didn't sign up for the Erdogan project, which is at least half the country, will feel down the line that, you know, you've sold the country away. You've radically changed the demography of the country, which is different to, you know, changing the institutional structure, or changing its alliance structure, whatever you have, right? But demographics is something that people are sensitive to in a whole different way. So if I was in the government's place, and if I was thinking about the longevity of the thing I've built, this would be the thing that I'd be most concerned about, I think, because at this point, you know, this is an intensely nationalistic society, and the linguistic fault line and the cultural fault lines do tend to be very important, right? So yeah, that is a problem they're going to have down the line.
Plus, if you look at the hinterland, I mean, in Syria, all along that border, you have very militant groups with guns roaming around, and we just don't know the extent to which they've penetrated at least border towns, what kind of, you know, cells they may have. And I mean,
and organized crime is becoming a bigger and bigger.
Too, it's they're criminal networks. It's not just ideology. It's, as you say, a lot of that happening too. But at the end of the day, I would say that I still have hope for Turkey, and I have infinite faith in the Turkish people's ability to regenerate. And when I say Turkish people, I mean Türkiye'li, the citizens of Turkey. And I'm a proud one. And I think, as you do, I love my country, and I remain hopeful in the future.
Yeah, there is always hope. Yeah.
Oh, come on, see.
No,
Well,
I'm hopeful as well. I mean, as I said, maybe this is something that we as a country had to live through to get through our system. But as you said, my fear is that something very bad has to happen before
things get better.
yeah.
And that's, of course, no consolation to all those innocent people who are in Turkish jails on trumped up charges, people like Osman Kavala and Selahattin Demirtas, Gültan Kışanak and Çiğdem Matar, and the list goes on and on and on. And that's what's really depressing. And the fact that torture is again prevalent, all of these things that Erdogan himself had addressed in the early years. Well, but then I do want to end on a hopeful note, so I insist. I do believe that things will get better eventually. Thank you so much, Selim, for joining us here today. It was great talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
And this brings us to the end of On the Middle East. Thanks for tuning in, and please do go to our website www.al-monitor.com for in-depth reporting on the Gaza conflict and much, much more. I hope to be back soon with you again with another episode of On the Middle East. Thanks again and goodbye.